So there you go, Roseanne, whenever you're ready.
That okay, I'd like to call the meeting to order tonight. We've got Bob Butler here to talk to us about different kinds of compensation packages. So I'm just going to turn it right over to Bob and Steve. So if you'd like to take over, Steve, and go on from there.
Sure. Thank you, Roseanne. So as the board knows, this session that we set aside tonight specifically was so that you all could have some conversation as we begin to go down the road of having a compensation committee discussion, but to first, begin with kind of maybe setting some ground rules, really starting to understand what the process potentially looks like, to really start considering what other plans might be worth our time to look at and review in advance, and kind of discussing our philosophy about how we move forward. I know that with that, I just kind of want to thank the board for, taking this on. I know that this is yet, another thing that is important and yet does take of your time for sure. I also know that many of you have either met or know of Bob Butler, who's with us tonight. And he'll certainly, I'm sure, do his own introduction, but I've known Bob for many years, consider him to be an expert on many things. And you all know that he serves as an attorney for the Wisconsin Association of School Boards. And Bob has agreed to work with us on this journey and be sort of our resident expert, if you will. And I'm sure as you hear from Bob tonight, you'll definitely realize that he's wildly informed on this topic, as he is been working with school districts really for many years, certainly the last 10 years, discussing compensation heavily. And you'll get some really honest feedback from Bob about what he's seen and experienced and how we might move forward from tonight on. And so, Bob, if you want to do any kind of introduction before we get going here beyond that, I'd certainly welcome that.
All right. Yeah. Thank you, Steve. Yeah. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Bob Butler. I'm a staff counsel and associate executive director with the School Board Association. I've had the privilege of working there for 30 plus years. So in that capacity, I've done a lot of legal work with districts and a lot involving employee issues, school law issues, et cetera. And one of the things that we've spent a fair amount of time on in the last, 10 years or so now, it seems like time has kind of gone by quickly, post Act 10 is working on employee compensation systems. And in that capacity, there's been a number of things that districts have looked at, is obviously like the financial sustainability of a program, the ability to attract and retain staff, and then to have them line up with what the community's goals and expectations are that you have, and certain things that are targeted. So in the post-Act 10, as things got restricted more and the bargaining was limited to total base wages, because of that, districts gravitated toward reviewing their compensation systems and deciding, is this how we want to pay staff within our budgetary parameters? And so there's a wide range of how things are done. Oftentimes I get asked, do you have a recommended pay plan? And I really don't, other than that it's locally created and locally accessed. And what I mean by that is that the people who are living underneath it had a voice in it, and that when you've put it together, you've done it in such a manner that's been collaborative, but it also has taken into account your finances and what your administrative capabilities are. And that when you do it, almost universally, districts don't do this and then it sits on a shelf and it stays in place for 10 years. So districts, these are often version 1.0s. And then as you go forward, you find out what worked, what didn't. The labor market changes, the expectations of employees change to some degree, and then you address those as you go forward. In preparation for this, I don't know, Steve, if everybody got a copy of the memorandum that I had put together or not.
Bob, my intention was to put it in board docs, and I don't think that they got it. So I'm seeing these blank looks. So I'm going to send it as a PDF to folks right now, and my apologies. But I do think that we want to talk through it. So the memorandum that Bob is talking about really is sort of a process document. So I'm just going to send that to everybody right now. But Bob, if you want to kind of just begin even while they're kind of getting that open.
Sure thing.
That'd be fine.
Sure thing. So, I mean, in looking at this, you have to kind of assess, what your motivations are for why you're doing it. And you kind of start with what presently exists. I had the opportunity to talk to Steve and Ruth. So they gave me some background on what your existing compensation system is and how it operates, and what the motivations are for examining that. So what exists at the present time, and how does that work for you? What's the motivation to address it? And as I explained to them previously, some districts went into this process a number of years ago and they've recycled it several times. Others, they're just starting it. They've started at different spots. Some haven't changed things at all. They've stayed with exactly what they had in the past. And so when we first start with that review and analysis of it, you look as to what's the motivation for a change. Is it fiscal? Is it your ability or inability to attract and retain staff? And all those factors come into your calculus as to what you want to do. And so there's really not a right answer. There's not a situation where I can tell you, oh, you definitely need to change this. You have to tell me that. And that's often, well, we have to change it because we're not able to attract people, or we're not able to retain them, or the cost of the existing structure is more than we can fiscally sustain, or it's, it was structured with an emphasis on this kind of thing that people are being motivated to do. And we'd rather motivate them to do something else. And so the only way to really figure all that out is to have a conversation between and amongst yourselves as to what your expectations are going forward. And the metaphor that I often give on this when we talk about teacher compensation systems, and these general themes would apply to other areas as well. So I don't want to say that you couldn't apply this kind of concept to administrators or support staff. But it starts with that basic core question as to, if we were to go into this, what are the general parameters we have for constructing it? And so the metaphor I often put forth is, if any of you ever done an addition to a house or a remodeling project, what is one of the first things you have a conversation with internally, the family conversation, before you meet with the contractor candidates?
Budget.
Budget, right. And because if you just came in and said, if Peter calls me as a contractor, says I want to redo my kitchen and a couple of bathrooms, if I don't ask for that, I'm going to come in with plans that are either going to way undershoot what he wants, because I'm going to make expectations that he doesn't have funds, or I'm going to come in with the most grandiose designs, and he's going to look and go, but this is more expensive than my house is. How can I afford this? And so as you go through this, it's not the only thing to consider. But when Steve and I were having this preliminary conversation, it was, I think you really have to get an idea of what you're going to spend, both in the near term and further down the road. And the difficulty we have right now in doing that is there's a lot of unknowns in your budget as of today. I mean, you have a budget you're living under. Ruth and Steve shared with me that you've settled with your teacher group, so you've got that in place. So that takes an unknown away. But as you know, we're coming up on the conclusion of a state budget biennium, and new state budget proposals are going to be put forth shortly. And then those are going to have expenditures going off into the next 2 years. We also don't know what's going to happen at the federal level, and whether additional funds are going to be supplied and distributed to school districts. So because of that, we don't have quite the clarity as to what your overall budget parameters might be today that you may have even a few months down the road. Even if the budget doesn't get settled at the state level right away, which historically, it's been a while since we had one settle in May or June, right? Just hasn't happened in a long time. But you at least see where the respective proposals are, what the governor has put forward, what the Joint Finance Committee is working on. So you get an idea of what you might have as additional funds to use toward a compensation system. So there's that fundamental first question as to where are you setting the price tag for what you think you can spend? And that obviously affects the dynamics for what you can add in, subtract, where you could spend dollars more efficiently, where there are things in the existing compensation system that don't align with your goals, or things that you've been wanting to do that you haven't, and you'd spend more resources to do those things. And so starting with that review of what's the total amount that you're spending today, and setting aside where you think you could be more efficient, what is going to be a sustainable model going forward? Because when some districts put in their compensation plans right after Act 10, there were several instances where they put something in and they thought, oh, this is going to be sustainable. And they put in motivators. Staff do certain professional development items, or student learning outcomes get to a certain level. And if those things happen, you'll get a larger pay increase. Well, people were they met those expectations. There was pent up wage demands. And suddenly 2 or 3 years into the pay system, the district had to say, hey, we can't afford this pay system that we just worked with you on for 1.5 years. It costs more than we had expected. On the flip side, there were districts that probably pulled in the reins too much, and they were so worried about the cost, they undershot it, and then staff exited because they weren't getting the kind of pay increases they wanted. So there's kind of that sweet science, and it's going to change as Ruth's going to come in with you each year and say, this is where we are because of our enrollment. This is where we are with open enrollees in or out. This is how our return on investments are. There's so many variables that come into play. So universally, what I've discussed with the board from the outset is, what are your financial parameters and what do you think is sustainable? The vast majority of districts in going into a pay system have looked at it as we are going to spend more money. A small portion of them have said we're going to spend more money, we're going to have to go to referendum to do it. When I say a small proportion, they may have gone to referendum on other issues like operating referendum and not specifically identified it was going to teacher compensation. Some did. And so that is part of obviously a larger strategic conversation with you if you're contemplating what your operating expenditures are going to be going forward. So that's a piece that I guess I would say to you, Roseanne, as the board president, that's where collectively as a group, you have to have some of that conversation with the administration to say, what do we think we can do financially near term? And then what are our expectations budgetarily going forward in developing a compensation system?
And
Okay.
Bob, as you kind of wrap up kind of that one piece of kind of the introduction, I just did want to let the board know that I had sent via email the document that Bob was referring to, which is kind of what he's sort of following as he talks, and Toby will put that in board docs as well. But one of the things that when Bob and I were chatting and with Ruth about preparing for this work session was to really be, very honest about, if compensation really is about attracting and retaining staff, it's about understanding what the desires and wants of staff are relative to compensation, then we probably really do need to, be having an open, honest conversation about what we're willing to spend to do that and how we might go about doing that, which, I shared with Bob that I think we feel a little bit of a sense of urgency. At least that's what I've felt from prior board conversations, but that it also may mean that to do it right, we may have to kind of pause or slow down a little bit to have some of these other discussions and how that potentially plays into our committee's conversations. And so I don't know if you're at this point, if you want to have some conversation here about the budget questions or where we might sit, or other direct questions that you'd have for Bob in terms of that sort of introductory piece relative to how you get this thing started.
Well, I know that we've heard from a lot of teachers that are used to the steps and lanes, and they're kind of upset if we're going to change them. And we talked about the different age and experience levels of our various teachers and where they would fit. And so I think that's something that we have to consider. We also talked about when this was set up, you were only allowed to take so many credits a semester so that your movement up in the lane was slower. And now you can do so much in almost in a weekend or a semester that the amount of money that we're spending is going up and up and up. So that's kind of what I remember we discussed. And then I talked to a couple people from the board of directors, and I know that Brett Hyde uses something different. And so that's what I think Bob's going to be talking to us about, different types of things. This is what I figured. But, and Ruth, you know exactly how much we're spending and if we can afford more and that sort of thing, correct?
I mean, that's something we'll have to determine as we work through the process, not just now, but every year.
Right.
Yeah, that we would have to determine what those parameters are that we want to work under.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anyone else have a comment?
I guess I have a comment or a question. Bob, do you see the benefits being tied with salary? Because the way I look at it too, it's one pot of money as a school board that we're looking at. And as a lot of districts, our benefit and health insurance in particular are going up every year. And we typically have those discussions separately. I guess I'd like to see them tied together and then maybe ask the staff, how would they like to allocate, here's our pot of money we have. Would you like more salary or more benefits? And they're the ones that it's affecting. It's hard for us as a school board to make that call.
Yeah, and there, Peter, that's something that I ask boards is it going to be salary only? Is it going to be salary and health insurance? Is it going to be salary, post-employment benefits, leave provisions, et cetera? Because there's all sorts of different things that attract and retain someone. The issue that I'm always sensitive to is that staff don't perceive that increases in salary came at the cannibalization of benefits, and that often creates some very difficult conversations internally between various staff. If some are very comfortable making moves on health insurance because they haven't had health issues or don't utilize the benefit, and then others who are incredibly reliant on it, either them or their family, and you can have some very divisive conversations on it. So it's not a reason not to address it. It's just that sometimes what I've done is, and I gave Steve and Ruth this example, we had a district I work with on the compensation for salary. They had to do something on their post-employment benefit. They could not sustain it with where their budget was at. But what they did was they decided that they were going to completely segregate that from the salary conversation. They brought in a different group to work with a different group of employees, and they basically said the savings there do not necessarily mean we're going to fund the salary increases one way or the other. We have to do this. And I've had other districts do that with health insurance. They got a 35% increase in health insurance rates in a year. They have to address it. Budgetarily, they have to do something. And so that kind of conversation can be together, but I think it would have to be, do you have something that's a glaring issue right away versus we're spending a bunch of money on a particular item. So that Roseanne brought up lane movement for additional educational attainment. If that was costing a lot, then perhaps that's something that you would visit and say, well, how can we reallocate that so there's a greater, more employees are being beneficiaries of our pay dollars we're spending versus those who access an online course and get 3 credits over a weekend. Because when the pay system was put into effect, that was not possible.
Right.
People had to take an entire semester to acquire something like that. And with a full-time teaching load, sometimes teachers couldn't do more than 6 credits in a year. It just took too long to have that happen. Well, now, because of the online learning, it's possible you can do it quicker. Now that there still may be circumstances where you say that's valuable, but there's a limit to it. I'm not telling you can't do online learning and get it done quickly because maybe there's some topic that the administration wants them to do, but there might be other circumstances where you say, well, even if you do that, there's a limit to how much per year to do that. But that also creates intra-staff dynamics, because then the person who's already gone through the schedule quickly, they are like a winner of the old system. And the new employees come in thinking, how much longer is it going to take me to get to their salary? And those are always tricky conversations because many districts I've worked with in this situation, they had to make these changes because they couldn't afford the annual fixed costs of the step and lane. And at the same time, they wanted to have something that was going to attract people and people could see a career pathway. You know, if I stayed in the district for 10 years, what would my salary be? And that when we've surveyed teachers, that is a very consistent response, is that desire of, I want to see a career pathway, kind of want to see the future, want to see how I can proceed on this.
I would just add to Peter, in talking with Bob and Ruth and others, you know, about this and in preparation for this, there's definitely, we hear that internally here in Burlington as well, that predictability of the path is a really critical element for folks. So I would imagine that as this conversation or process moves forward, that we will hear that those of you who are serving on that committee will hear that from staff as well. And I definitely think that we probably represent, you know, one of those districts that Bob's referring to, where we're you know, financially we're feeling really strapped. There is a sense of a burden of unsustainability, and at the same time, I believe it's the desire of the board to figure out, how do we put a system in place that is sustainable but also is attractive, and so how do we kind of do that money dance, if you will. So I think it's just a great question.
Yeah, and along with it, Steve's doing or saying what I do in the beginning of this. So once we get the rough ideas of where you are, then there is like an introduction to the staff as to what the labor market looks like for teachers in a general sense. You can get specific data for our part of the state and have that forward. And then looking at why districts make changes, what kind of comp plans are out there. But then there is a survey of the staff as to, you know, what do you value in compensation? And Peter, that can include things beyond just their salary. You know, how they view, so typically health insurance and leave provisions come up pretty high. So, and then there's other things on working conditions, class sizes, et cetera. But then it's like, so what do you value presently? What would you like to have added? What are your concerns going into this process? You know, what are you afraid of? And then what are your hopes and expectations? And I'm summarizing, there's obviously many more questions than that. But then you get a feel for how every district is. And as I shared with Ruth and Steve, in the years doing these, the vast majority of times districts have changed their compensation plans because there's been that financial thing, they had to do it. And or their turnover was so high that they're like, we can't keep having 10% of our staff leave every year. It's costing us a fortune in training them and the educational disruption. On some rare occasions, you know, it has been, they've gone through the whole survey, they looked at things and said, I think I can keep the present system. I just need to make these couple little minor tweaks, you know, and then we're good to go. So I don't come in with any disposition or plan as a facilitator on this. And I'm completely content if the district stays right where they are, if they come up with something completely different. But what I have seen has been primarily the big issues where they have fallen down have been, is it financially sustainable? Is it something your administration can implement? You know, and then basically, is it something that the staff, they don't have to necessarily be jumping up and down and doing the wave in a stadium over it, but do they view it and understand it? Like, I know why this had to happen, and this makes some rational sense. You know, in the aggregate, there's going to be people who are going to love it because they're going to view, I'm a winner in this. Others who are going to go, I would have been better off in the old system, but they may see the rationale behind it. But it's, again, I tell people it's version 1.0. And so when you put them in, you're going to recalibrate this and make some fine tuning. Hopefully, if it's one that I assist you in, it's not a complete throwing it out the window after 1 year, right? Because most of the time I can kind of see, or even in your conversations with your committee, you can kind of see those pressure points where this isn't going to work probably long term. just because the cost or the time. Yeah, and what I've seen, if there's been a trend in the last 10 years, many districts have gone in with the expectation of we're going to have a simpler plan than some of the ideas that were being proffered around 2011, 2012. And that's probably natural because right after Act 10, there was a lot of, well, you could try this innovative approach. You can try that innovative approach. And then as time went on, I had more and more boards saying, I want the pay system to motivate people, but I don't want teachers to, if they have to make that call between helping that child and or meeting with that parent or working on something that gets them a pay increase in a pay model, I don't want them to pick the latter. I don't want them working on something to acquire points to go up the scale versus thinking they're giving up something versus helping that kid out on their particular assignment. And so, and then they've used that as a recruitment and retention tool. If you come to us, we don't have you do 500 different things outside of your core job to get a pay increase. So it's, again, there's not a right or a wrong answer, but those are some of the things I've seen as trends over the last few years.
Okay.
Can I chime in further? I mean, I think I have, and I'd like to hear from other board members, but what you, Bob, you were asking our goals. I think we're and kind of where we're at. And I'm sure Steve's shared this with you, but right now we're fiscally pinched. I mean, the steps and lanes doesn't seem sustainable in the near future. So I think that's one goal, is to come up with a system we can use in the short term. Also attracting and retaining staff. We're kind of in between. We lose folks to the Milwaukee suburban districts, but we also are able to attract teachers from smaller districts. And then I think this is Roseanne's point too. I wonder if what's a good system to set up for motivating our teachers to increase their professional development, and whether that current system, I'm not sure, is the best one either too. I have questions about that. That's something I'm curious if that's something you survey the staff on. They may be the best people to.
Yeah, no, we do. And there's different approaches that have happened. Everything from, one extreme where the Eau Claire School District, when working with them, they basically pay for a master's degree. And other than that, there's no other professional development pay. There's no additional credits or anything like that. And part of the reason they did that is they built in, I can't remember the exact number now, but it was like 9 or 10 days into the calendar where the district provided professional development. And so their theory was, yeah, we'll reward you for the master's degree, but the 6 credits or whatever, we're doing our own, in essence, Eau Claire University, not through UWEC, but their own internal professional development. Other districts don't have that luxury of having that kind of infrastructure. And so they may have looked at different things and said, well, maybe it'll be 6 credits at a college or university. Maybe it'll be some other form of professional development. So there might be something that's as valuable or more valuable that doesn't entail the necessity for you to pay tuition. And for younger staff, that can be a big deal because they don't want to acquire more student debt. So there's different ways to make it attractive to people. But to your point, Peter, once we survey the staff, you'll have a better idea of what you think they might like. And then we'll ask some demographic questions, because what I've found helpful in the committee process is, your staff have come together, but they may have come and had different life experiences. So maybe somebody was in the military and had a ROTC scholarship. Maybe someone went to college 30 years ago. And so student debt wasn't a huge issue for them, but they have kids, so they realize it. And even amongst your new staff, one person might come in with a lot of student loan debt, another one might not have any. So there's some of that when they converse amongst themselves as to what they desire to have on this. And then the other tricky part has always been the labor market, because the superintendent I worked with in one of these in the very beginning said, if I was to pay, and this was his opinion, if I was to pay teachers based on who I think has a job that has a huge impact, it'd be first grade teachers. Because if students can't read, then everything thereafter is problematic. But at that time, the labor market was such, there were a lot more people who had certification to teach first grade than there were tech ed, special ed, et cetera. And so the labor market may dictate different salaries than what objectively you might view as that's quote unquote a job that's important. So it's always that divorcing the jobs in quote unquote importance from what is the labor market dictating, because in some areas, as Steve and Ruth can tell you, some of our districts literally get no applicants with an actual certification. I mean, they're on emergency licensure. So that's obviously that person has much different bargaining leverage and power in the individual negotiations than a position that has, a number of, maybe not a number is the wrong word, because overall the numbers are down for a number of applications for positions, but there's still people applying for them.
Isn't it predicted, though, that there's going to be a teacher shortage in all areas?
Oh, there is already, Roseanne. Yeah, and that's some of the information looking at it. And you may not be as hit hard as some other parts of the state. And then the pandemic just exacerbated that. But yeah, in some parts of the state, when I started 30 years ago, if someone said to me, I don't have any applicants for social studies or Phi Ed, that wouldn't have been something that we experienced back in 1990. It was the complete opposite. There was an oversupply. So you're right, Roseanne, it's spread to more areas, but in some areas it is. I mean, I get calls from districts of, I don't know how I'm going to comply with the kid's IEP because we can't hire a special ed teacher. I have no one to apply. So what's my legal liability if I do not have a special education teacher?
Wow.
So that's where we get in these conversations about sustainability. In that district, they may have a sustainability issue as well, but they have to make some drastic decisions as to how are we going to be sustainable and still meet our legal requirements to follow an IEP. And as I said, southeastern Wisconsin, and I'd say like South Central, Dane County, Fox Valley, the districts in those regions, they've probably had better luck finding staff than some other areas of the state.
Yeah, that's going to bring up a lot of licensing problems with the DPI.
Yeah, and there's been more flexibility there, but yeah, there's all sorts of different things that you can address and things that can be available to you, whether it's loan forgiveness programs, et cetera. But I know from having done this with a number of districts that for staff, that career pathway, a compensation system that's easy to understand, those are important. But as equally important is, I think, some of the stuff Steve was alluding to, those other benefits, and then just generally, what do people think of the working conditions? So I've told districts who started this who thought, oh, there's no way we're going to have a competitive compensation plan and have low turnover because we'll never be able to meet the salaries of X district in our area. They can do it through effective principal staff relationships, just the overall professional development, collaborative planning on curriculum. They can't necessarily always compete, but I kind of view them as, to make a sports analogy, there could be small market teams that also can compete well, in athletics. They just they don't have as much room for error because they don't have the money to kind of fill the gaps if they do something improperly.
It may also be worth, just for the board as a reminder, because I found myself mentioning this to Bob in our prior conversation, and that is if we take aside this year and set this year aside with the pandemic and go back even just 1 year, Connie and I spent a lot of time really crunching some numbers about what our attrition rate was, what our turnover rate was, which was well below the state average, as you may recall, that the state average does hover around 10% for school districts. And we were fortunately sitting at about 3%. And so, and that had been Burlington's track record for a number of years. And so our ability to retain staff has been really great. And I do think that is attributable to, sort of the wonderful schools, the wonderful school culture, great leadership, dedicated teachers, a very, very kind of safe, warm community that people wanted to really put roots down in. And so, that is definitely noteworthy, that, the ability to retain is there. And that may be something that through this process, we just want to keep ourselves kind of reminded of as well, because that to Bob's kind of small market analogy, that can be a really critical point, potentially, as we try to, navigate what those things are that matter. And I don't know, then, Peter, you had kind of talked about, you stopped at the professional development piece, but I didn't know if you had others in there as well.
No, those are the big three. I mean, those are for that I identify in the short term. I will say I saw in Bob's outline that you're looking at a compensation comparison with other districts. A year ago, Taylor and I sat in at a school board convention, so literally a year ago, a couple sessions on this topic. And I think this kind of got at least he and I talking, and then I think other board members about that, and looking at from a labor market basis on how we do compared to our neighbors. I'm very interested in that, and that may fuel discussion in our board and then later in our community about operating referendum, because I suspect right now we're just not going to be able to meet. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know what the market is. So whether we need an operating referendum or not, I think could flow from that survey information.
Yeah, and I'll say, Peter, in that pre-Act 10, that was a lot easier to figure out. Yeah, because everybody had a salary grid, and we'd go to arbitration if you didn't offer a qualified economic offer. So I could figure out how you ranked compared to everybody else relatively easily. Now, there's some districts who are willing to share everything, maybe like the one where you went to the convention presentation on. Others who they're not willing to share a whole lot. And then even if you do share it, I can't really figure out how they're being paid from the pay system itself. There's a lot of variables about if this happens, then you'll get this, et cetera. So one of the ways we end up doing it is looking at what's called the 1202 report by DPI, which lists each person's individual salary. And some districts have gotten so sophisticated with it that Steve may remember this from his former position, as some of the districts in that area, you did this, they would get the 1202 data and they'd say, oh, well, we need a high school biology teacher. Oh, let's see what every high school biology teacher makes in this region. Oh, what are the scores that the school has? Oh, this teacher, they seem to have good outcomes and she's not making a lot. Cold call her and offer $7 or $8 grand more. And that happened all the time. And so that doesn't really create a pay plan. That creates free agency for some individuals that are in highly sought positions. And that can create all sorts of working conditions issues that can inadvertently lead to more turnover, because then, other teachers, because all this is public records, figure out what someone else makes and goes, how'd that happen? So as I had one board member say when we went through this process once, you have now this environment, probably the goods of free agency, but from an employee, so you have that flexibility, but you also have the public records. So everybody knows everybody else's salary. So it's not like the private sector where most of the time you could go in and try to negotiate with your boss and get a pay increase, but you probably don't know what every one of your coworkers makes. It's just not readily available. Or if you do, you're doing it based on what they share with you, which may or may not be reliable. Here, as you know, all the salaries and benefits anybody can get. So I think, when we met earlier this week and just had like a preparatory call, one of the things that I brought up was that internal dialogue between amongst yourselves as to what could fiscally be possible, but then also the timing issue. And my recommendation at that time was that when we spoke earlier this week of definitely encouraging the conversation to happen, and perhaps having the introductory meeting with a committee, if you choose to have a committee to review this issue, to kind of go through what's happening in the world on this topic in the state. What are the initial thoughts, maybe doing the survey, but probably not diving into the nuts and bolts until we get a better sense as to what the state's going to do. And that just being that there is such a wide array of information. Like just today, Dan Rossmiller with our government relations staff shared it, and I don't know if they put up a blog post on this yet, but state revenue is higher than they initially had anticipated, which is a good thing for either school expenditures or if they look at tax cuts or something else. It's always better to have that answer versus, oh, they said they had $1 billion more in the red. So we will know relatively shortly what the initial budget proposals will look like in a few weeks from the governor's office. And then we'll see what the legislature's response is to that from the Joint Finance Committee, whether they just totally ignore it and come up with their own, or whether they work off of the governor's proposal. But even though this is a long-term pay plan, I just feel it's a little bit better to have a little bit of a delay. I'm not talking long, we're just talking a couple of months. And then you have better information to go from, and it helps the facilitation process. One of the things I said to Steve and Ruth is, in some circumstances, I have had boards who say, well, if kind of using the old Field of Dreams line, if you build it, they will come. Don't worry about the price tag. Just go create what you think is the perfect pay plan. And I caution the board saying the difficulty with that is it's really hard to ever get people to prioritize. Because if everything is in the realm of possibilities financially, the conversation about should this happen or should that happen doesn't occur. And I'll give an example of something that I'm not going to say is not controversial, I should say not controversial, not a good thing, but it generally doesn't impact a lot of employees. And that's like, let's say, pay for National Board for Professional Teaching Standards. That if money is not an issue in the conversation, if there's 2 teachers in the district who have it or are working toward it, everybody says, yeah, keep that. Keep the $10,000 in on that proposal. If, however, there's a finite amount of money, there may be a conversation as to, do we want to spend $10,000 on that? Or do we want to give everybody $40 more? And that's, if there isn't budget parameters, it's hard to ever get to that point of, well, what would you rather have? The whole schedule go up by $40 or have $10,000 go 5 to one person, 5 to another? Because otherwise the conversation is just, well, do both. Add both into the pay system. And again, I'm not passing judgment saying that the National Board isn't valuable. There are plenty of districts who have it, and they can really have great value for a school system. But that could be something that you could come back and say, yeah, we want to do it. I mean, I had one district where they initially wanted to have every teacher get Title I, or not Title I, basically be a reading specialist in K through 5. And they're going to pay for it. And then when they got further down the comp plan, they're like, this is just fiscally impossible. We can't do it. But at the beginning, it was like, oh, that'd be tremendous because reading is so important. We have to have everybody do this. Yeah, we'll pay for that. And as they started building the plan, it was like, that is literally impossible. We would have to ask for tens of millions of dollars to fund that thing.
I think Diane had some comments. I
Yeah.
saw her hand go up earlier.
Yes, that was this. Okay. Yeah, I had written down some things like sustainability and being competitive and all. And I thought it was interesting when you talked about predictability, because I had that on my list, and predictability for staff, but it also has to be predictable for us so that we know for the next year and the year after, maybe long-term, maybe more short-term, what we can expect is going to happen. The other thing I'd just like to mention that as far as I've seen where districts have incentives, and there's lots of little ways that you can start to move that maybe don't involve taking classes. Maybe it's going to be that you run a workshop or you attend some sort of a program. And these all start to be kind of how do you keep track of some of those kind of incentives?
Correct.
Especially if you don't have an HR person in your district to handle all that.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that's why, Diane, when I said in the beginning, when these things first started happening, we put on these compensation workshops, and we had Heartland Lakeside, it's a K-8 underneath Arrowhead Union High School, present, and Sun Prairie, and there were Kettle Moraine. And we would say before each presentation, and the presenters would say this too, this is to give you a flavor of what's out there. Don't copy this. Even though we love it and we're very proud of it, don't copy this. And then people went out and copied them. And some of them who copied, let's say like a Sun Prairie that at that time had a really robust professional development program, they couldn't run it. The administrations could not do it. And so when you look at all of these things, this, as you said, the sustainability is just not financial. It's also, you don't want to burn the teachers out. You want to see if you have administrator capacity. And as I said, I think as time's gone on, pay plans, at least that I've seen, have tended to get a little bit simpler, because the staff probably came back and gave the feedback of, I'm spending a lot of time on the pay plan, not on curriculum development or assessments or whatever else it was you want, being a coach. We had that in one school system where when they put the pay plan in, they had a bunch of people quit their extracurricular assignments because they're like, well, I can make more money doing these things in the pay plan than I can staying to be an advisor. And the advisorship consumes a ton of time. I'm really into doing the musical or whatever, and now I'd rather spend that money acquiring my points so I can move through the pay system. So those are all things that when you have the dialogue with the staff and you get that survey results, you're in a better spot to do that, because the staff will come in with, they'll have a plan too. They'll say, oh, we really like the plan that's in effect in X district, or can't we just stay with what we have? If they like, can you fully fund the step and lane movement? And if the answer is, I can't because the lanes are happening too quickly, then that's, whether you tweak the existing, like I said, or you go to something that's much different, at least they would have the data to show why the status quo cannot continue if that's actually the case.
Diane, did you have another question? No, okay.
Actually, can I jump into, I wanted to, along the lines of professional development, Diane had sent us earlier a model or a seminar presentation that talked about these incentives. It got me thinking about it. And I guess question for you, Bob, is can a district require professional development? You mentioned Eau Claire earlier, they must do internal professional development, either through PLCs or some other form. But can you require without compensating a teacher, outside professional development?
Yep. It could be an assignable duty. Yeah, I mean, in some districts, think of it this way: if you had an update to the math curriculum or something, and you say we're gonna have you do X, Y, or Z, you have to acquire that. That could just be an expectation of that job. Now, again, in the marketplace, if you ask me to go pay for collegiate credits and don't give me any more pay, and I have to spend additional time outside of the job, then it's perhaps not as attractive. Some people will like it because it's like, oh, I'm getting intrinsic growth from this. And that's something too to be cognizant of when you do these comp plans is using that small market analogy. It's some districts that we put all this money into professional development, we train them, and then the other district knows we do such a great job. They come in, and then just after I've gone through my 5 years of professional development training, they just hire my staff away. So I paid everything to make an analogy to another field. I paid all the apprenticeship costs, and then they're getting the carpenter. It's so you kind of have to be cognizant of that fact too. And some of them built in these elaborate promissory note structures so that if they paid for it, the person didn't take all that and just go run off right away when they got a bigger pay increase. So the big thing is you coalesce around what it is that you want as core values in a pay plan, what you feel financially you can sustain, and then you see what the staff's feelings are, and you see where we have alignment. And those are the low hanging fruit, and then going forward to see, well, what are the possibilities based upon this?
Okay. Anybody else have a comment or question? So you suggest we do the questionnaire fairly soon?
Well, what I would suggest is first that you internally have a conversation about what are you spending now?
Right.
What do you think is sustainable, even though we have a lot of unknowns? If we came in and said, well, the cost added above the existing pay plan is X%, you know, what's the X percent that you feel, yes, that can happen? You know, that we can afford. Like this year, Ruth told me you get did you do a 2% or a 1.81? I'm trying to remember.
1.81.
1.81%.
The CPI.
The CPI. So let's say you say, well, we can afford CPI increase. And right now CPI is running below 1.81. So at least that you're thinking, okay, that's the ceiling. And then you would work off of that going forward. And that's why right now, Roseanne, it's hard because I have no idea what the legislature is going to offer for a per pupil increase. We don't know how they're going to handle some of the really strange things that happen with student enrollment statewide this year. And as far as the revenue limit and averaging out the pupil attendance. So there are some things that although it won't be crystal clear in a few months, it's better off. But you can still have those general conversations as a board. Then the next piece would be, if you were going to have a committee to look at these things, that committee would have some introduction to, like, how do the processes work? What are other compensation systems like? And you go from there. I mean, I've had it where I've started processes and I had a board that wanted to put and pay people more based on educator effectiveness evaluations, and teachers were vehemently opposed to it. And sometimes during the meeting of the process, they went by each other. And some of the staff persons who had really high educator effectiveness scores were like, oh, that would work great for me. I'd love it for you to pay me more. And others would be like, well, I don't know if I want to do it on educator effectiveness scores, because, you know, the story that was given in one district was the AP English teacher does this phenomenal job. And when I come in and watch her classroom, the kids are model citizens. They're totally on task. They're working in small groups. They're wonderful. I go into this other class, which I won't identify the curriculum area. He does a phenomenal job, but he's herding cats for 15 minutes. And it's not him. I think he's doing a phenomenal job with these kids, but it is a different group of kids that he's working with. Who gets the higher score in educator effectiveness? You know, and that was the piece that swayed the board to not be quite as keen on that. But some of the teachers were like, man, I'm nailing educator effectiveness. I certainly hope they pay based on the evaluations, you know? So once they talk to each other, Roseanne, I think you can kind of figure things out, and having not just the teachers and board members, but, you know, administrators there. So principal, Ruth, you know, people who have the background in your organization to kind of tell you, well, yeah, if you do this, think of this possibility as well, though.
So yeah, I would add that one of the kind of hopes for this session with you all tonight was sort of the wonderment about how best to move forward. Certainly, you know, if the board says, well, okay, let's work through understanding, well, what are we spending now? That is something that Ruth would be able to provide. We could definitely have ongoing conversations about what potentially the board's desire to spend going forward might be. In the meantime, based on our prior conversations, I have assembled a committee that does follow a structure much like what is in the document that you have from Bob. And I'm just waiting kind of for tonight's meeting to notify all those folks that they are selected for the committee. We had 18 staff who've applied, and I've identified 12 who would serve on the committee and 6 alternates. And it is, we've paid attention to everything from what band are they in their career, in their first kind of 10 years, second 10 years, or third 10 years, We've identified our elementary voices, middle school voices, high school voices, core subject areas, elective subject areas, gender. We've looked at all of the variables and have a really nice team. And so I could certainly reach out to that team. We could move forward and, kind of as is being suggested here a little bit, have a meeting with the committee, a first meeting, and really start talking a little bit about process, timing, desires, hopes, dreams, etc. From there, we could issue the survey to the staff, and then potentially pause for a little bit, see what happens with the state budget, and talk to the committee about how they might feel about even working over the summer or meeting over the summer as well, if that's an option. To keep the process moving is probably key, but I definitely am thinking that it's potentially worth heeding Bob's advice to, not jump in totally with both feet until we know a little bit more information, because this is our launching point. But that would be at least one approach, is to continue to, navigate the money question, have an initial meeting and start the survey, and then wait for a little bit. But we're all ears. I'm all ears. If there's questions, additional questions for Bob, Ruth, myself, Connie, about, what's on your minds or how you might want to proceed from here. That's the magic of tonight. You can talk about whatever you want.
I think with everything that we've kind of all discussed and everything that Bob has laid out, which has been a plethora of fantastic information, a lot more than I expected to get tonight. But it's great. So I think after hearing that and then hearing what Steve just said, I'm completely fine with going along with what Steve's recommendation is. And obviously, of course, with the advice of Bob as well. I'm totally on board with that.
Okay, anyone else? Barry.
So, Bob, I'm guessing if you had the answer to this, you wouldn't be with us and you'd be retired on a beach somewhere. But how do we establish a known fixed cost model going forward on a variable income model that can change at any given moment? I mean, that's what ultimately makes this current state unsustainable.
Right. No, it's a great question. I mean, so there's a couple of different ways of doing it. One is what I'll call the less expensive option. It's just where you kind of take the model and then roll everybody through it for 5 years with some assumptions. The more expensive version of that is you do the same thing, but you hire an actuary to do it. And so that, the actuary comes in and says, this is what I anticipate this pay plan will cost by doing it, because I'm going to make these assumptions on attrition rates, going to make these assumptions on retirements, going to make these assumptions on CPI, et cetera. And so at the bare bones, we would do an Excel spreadsheet that would basically take it and working with Ruth in the business office and flow people through. And so when Steve talked about your historical turnover, if you stayed at a rate that low, then you're going to have a lot of people moving through this pay system. And that's not a bad thing, because one of the things that doesn't get figured into the cost equations, and it's kind of hard to capture, is the cost of attrition. What does that cost you in lost educational skill? What does it cost you in administrative time? While recognizing that sometimes it's a good thing when someone exits. All right, but that's generally not the majority of the departures. The majority are ones that you'd rather they didn't leave. But with the numbers that when Ruth and Steve shared your turnover numbers, those are phenomenal. I mean, at that, now granted, this year it's, I wouldn't judge anybody on this year's numbers. I don't think they're statistically reliable because of everything that's happened. But the statewide average is around 13%. So 13% of the staff are turning over every year. So you being at 3, that's pretty impressive. And so that's one of those things of, as I mentioned to Steve and Ruth, and I think I said this earlier, out of the districts I've done with this, I did have one that went through it and just said, I think we're checking all the boxes other than we can just make this little tweak and we're going to leave it alone because it's working for us. Yeah, but that's just one component of it. Obviously, you get the whole financial piece, but so that's a question ultimately you can decide as a group whether you want to bring the actuary in or not. And if you came with a completely different pay system that had no grounding at all in what you're doing right now, I would recommend an actuary, because that way you're going to have someone who's professionally trained to make these various assumptions, and they'll use ETF data on retirements. They'll use the ETF data. It's the Department of Employee Trust Funds on, the actual turnover rate in the first 5 years, et cetera. So you'll have a ballpark guess as to what the long-term cost would be.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, and Ruth, I'm just wondering because, based on Barry's question and Bob's response, when would even be the last time potentially that we dug that deep into costings where there was potentially an actuary involved, or has it ever?
I'm not aware as far as costings that we've ever had an actuary come in and do that work.
Okay.
As far as, salaries, structures, I don't think that's ever, I'm not aware that it's been done.
Yeah, and I should say the vast majority of districts have not used an actuary because they haven't come up with something that they couldn't get an idea on. But I did have some that they came up with something so completely novel that the board felt we have to go beyond just what I'll call a cast forward spreadsheet of taking people for 5 years. But yeah, again, that you'll get an idea for that as you see how the process is going as to where you want to be. And if you decide, well, we want to go to a referendum, and the referendum has as a component in some small measure or large measure that covers the comp plan, and you're going out and asking the public, we want so much to fund teacher compensation, you may want to have the actuary, because then you're able to say the actuary told us this is what they perceive this model is going to cost.
Yeah, typically I've seen actuaries more with retirement benefits than salary structure.
Yeah, for sure. I just, it is interesting as you hear the conversation and the dialogue, it's like, here we are, it's time to probably ask a question like that, because I didn't think that was the case, that we had gone that route. It's just Barry's question that kind of prompted me to wonder, like, had we ever, and that's just helpful to know, I think.
Can I ask a clarifying question? I like the outline Steve gave on what the process could look like, and Bob's advice on slowing down and waiting for the state to give us some certainty on what our revenue is going to look like. At what point though would you mentioned, Bob, earlier, the first step is the board needs to look at the current spending now that we're spending on salary, and what can we afford in the near term as far as increases? When does that fit into the timeline?
Oh, I would have that. That's 1A.
Okay. So we should set up a meeting as soon as possible, in other words, where we get data from Ruth on what we're spending.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. And that's, again, that's the snapshot in time right now. That's not going to tell you what maybe you can spend in the future, because we're waiting on state and if there's any federal funds coming, et cetera. And the federal funds are most likely going to be one-time funds. So it's going to be hard to build a comp plan around that.
And one thing that I would like, Ruth, I'm sure you've given it to us before, but just how many people are at the different levels? How many have their masters? How many have, bachelor's +6 or whatever? Just in years experience. I know we've got a lot of teachers who've been here a long time, and I guess I'd like to see all that, because to get a better picture of who we are.
Okay.
Well, I don't want to make any assumptions, Ruth. I'm fairly confident you can produce both what Diane was talking about as well as current cost of certified staff pretty quickly. So, I mean, we could provide that to the board as soon as, our next meeting, right?
Yeah, where everybody is in each cell, we do that scattergram for negotiations, so that we already have.
I think I saw that.
Years of service, maybe a longevity report or something.
Yeah, what Toby's using now for longevity would be
Yeah,
cues, I think.
yeah.
Okay.
So that would give us a good start on February 8th.
It definitely would address, the question that, Bob's posing for the board to consider of, well, what are we currently spending? So that would give you that baseline as well as some of the things that Diane identified. And then, we could potentially, I could communicate with the committee and, maybe it's not, we had a February committee date that was going to be on, but I believe February 10th. And I may, communicate with the committee that, pick maybe the next date, not the one right away because it's so close to that board meeting. But to, maybe potentially use the second date that was going to be for the compensation committee, which if I look at that would be March 1st. That was 5:30 to 7:30 on March 1st as a way to then launch with them. I certainly don't want the committee to just wonder, hey, what's going on? And so, we would certainly bring, Taylor, Peter, Diane, who are going to serve on that committee, Bob, and bring the whole group together and begin to, really kind of lay some groundwork, try to have a conversation kind of like this, start building some capacity, some trust, some understanding of the process, and then, talk about the forthcoming need for a survey as well as our desire to go a little bit slower than, what I may have originally articulated, not thinking about sort of the status of the state budget at this point.
Okay.
I
Any
think that
other
makes
comments?
sense, Steve, because one of the things that you want to have momentum in these processes once you get going, but it's going to be highly reliant as to, its success is highly reliant on transparency and people having faith in the process and the data that you're sharing. And so launching and meeting with them and just saying, hey, these are some of the things that are considered in a pay system, or these are the overall things that we're contemplating, I think makes sense. It will reduce anxiety levels because whenever people say, oh, they're looking at a pay system, the imagination can go in a million different directions, and it shows a certain prudence versus, well, we're going to charge ahead, and then if they tell us we have no new money, we're still doing this, or if we have a bunch of new money, we're just going to do the same thing. It's a more informed process.
Are there sample surveys that we could look at to use, or is this something we'd have to develop from scratch?
No, I have them, and then one of the things that you can do with the compensation committee, and it is a great question, Diane, because when I found it to be most successful is not a survey that's just in the can that I say, here's the survey to use. You take that template and then you walk through the committee with the survey. And so some questions can be excluded, but then it also uses local terminology versus what I have in the set survey. So let's say, for example, I say specials teachers. Well, maybe you call them Encore or something, you have something else, or you don't refer to LMC staff, the library media consultants, you refer to it as something else. You have your own terminology. And then to Peter's question, it might have been, oh, I didn't see you had anything in here on outside professional development or something. We can add that in. Or if it was post-employment benefits or health insurance, we can add those particular things in that you would like to add into the program, or loan forgiveness programs, or whatever it happens to be. So, and it's also an opportunity, it builds some trust and camaraderie But then it also, if they've had input on the survey, if another teacher comes up, and Diane, if you were one of my fellow teachers, I say, Dan, you were on the committee. What does this mean? You were there. And so even though you maybe weren't the author of it, you have some sense of what it's about.
Anybody else?
Other thoughts and questions? I mean, it's good dialogue.
Yeah, anybody else? This has been really good.
Ruth, this one may not be as easy for you to pull together. Sorry. Could we get maybe the last 5 to 6 years average rate increase on the insurance costs?
Yeah, I think I have that. I mean, we'll
Because
have
then we can
to,
kind of predict, I mean, we can't obviously predict exactly, but we can get a feel for what we have to factor into our budget every year.
yes, we have that. We just have to be mindful that there's been plan design changes along with that.
Yeah,
So,
it's a good point.
Yeah, and I think when Ruth just said that, that did trigger something for me, Taylor, that when she started talking about plan design changes, most of the time, again, I've segregated the health insurance. So if you were going to make a plan design change that they, let's say the insurance consultants came in and said, because of your experience rating or whatever, we recommend you make this change in office visit copays, or we have this wellness incentive. My preference is those things are segregated from the salary conversations, because otherwise it often turns into people viewing that their pay increases were the result of the cannibalization of the health insurance benefits. So it's when those things you're going to do anyway, let's put it that way, the health insurance change you're going to do irrespective, maybe it does free up money, but it's not a direct quid pro quo. It's not a direct exchange for the pay plan. It's best to have that segregated, in my opinion. And oftentimes districts have a separate standalone health insurance committee that doesn't have a say in the salary. I mean, I know it all comes together in your budget, but that way it's, the health insurance committee or task force is standing, it reviews these issues, and the salary group is separate. But even though the survey data may say that staff really value the health insurance, it just seems to be more productive that way when I've worked with districts on putting a final plan together.
Thanks.
Barry, do you think, even given that, Barry, do you think that like would you still like to see it?
No, in the context that Bob put it in, I don't know that it's going to be beneficial to us. To kind of speak to Bob's point, though, we've never changed benefit plans to save the district money. We've changed benefit plans to minimize the increase.
Right, yeah.
We've never been able to take money because, we saved this on benefits and now we can throw that to salary. We have to keep changing to minimize our expense. And having a feel for what those expenses are falls into overall compensation, whether we want it to or not, because we get limited money to spend.
I mean, given that, Barry, if you just are curious and want to know, I mean, my sense is that Ruth tracks everything, just FYI, and she is more than capable of grabbing, 5 years worth of, hey, how much did the insurance go up? Even though there were plan changes and there are other variables, certainly. And not that, Ruth, I don't want to put more work on your plate, but I think it's relatively easy if it's just one of those things where you're like, hey, I would just like to know, and it may inform the way that I'm able to think about, what we're paying people and what compensation looks like. If it's helpful information, I think we should get it so that you can think openly about it.
I think we already have that pretty easily.
If it's not burdensome to gather, I would like to see it.
No,
I don't want to see you spend half a day gathering it, though.
No, I think we already have it in a format that would, yeah,
Sure. And
we can get that.
It may actually reinforce, Bob's point of why you keep them separate. Because you'll probably be, I mean, it's stunning how much money it is actually, what the cost of benefits. And so it just may be one of those things that help kind of affirm this idea that you keep them separated.
I guess I see the point of keeping them separate, but I'm sure when you survey staff that for some staff members, it's going to be all about a strong benefit plan as far as retention goes. And you've got your young teachers coming in often with student loans that they need to pay off. They're looking at the salary more than they're looking for some sort of a plan that might be a family plan and they're single. So I can see how they need to be separate, but I think in the minds of many of the staff, they might, it has an importance.
Oh, definitely, Diane. And I think that's part of, the survey will ask them what they value. And so you'll get the full group. But I think when the comment was made about how the changes have typically been done to mitigate cost increases versus where I've seen it work detrimentally is, and I'm picking numbers that aren't necessarily based on a real case, they're just illustrative. You're paying $2,000 a month on family health insurance plan, and you say, well, we're going to make these changes and it goes down to $1,500, and we're going to give you all that savings under the salary schedule. That can be, to your point, you'll have some people who say that's the greatest thing they ever did, and others who will be irate. And they won't be focused on the pay system. They'll be focused on the health insurance change. And so that's always the conundrum. If you have a 35% increase, you're going to have to do something whether you change the comp plan or not. That's an inevitable piece of it. So you'll get an idea of where staff feel are their priorities. My guess is this year, like right now, if we do the survey right now, leave provisions are going to rank higher than they did 2 or 3 years ago.
I think so.
So, things go in cycles on particular items, but it doesn't mean we don't ask the questions. You can just decide it. I have had districts where they had like I said, they have a separate segregated health committee, but what that did influence the money that was coming into the pay plan later on. They just didn't address it in the same meeting with the same group of people to say, do you want to go to this deductible? Well, if you do, I can give you more money on the pay system.
Sorry, Bob, you said what was a potential pressing issue this year? You said leave?
Leave, yeah, sick leave, family leave.
Sure.
Just,
Okay. Thank you, sir.
Bob, the standalone health insurance cost or benefit committee, is it similar to the compensation committee that you've seen where you're bringing in staff members and doing surveys too? I mean,
yes. Yep. Yeah. Some districts do that with your insurance consultant. So I don't know who you have as an insurance consultant, but oftentimes she or he assists the district in that process because a lot of the changes, and I'm sure Ruth, you've probably gone through this with some of the elements of the plan. Staff have, if people come in or out of a network, or if you incorporated like an HSA or an HRA, there could be all sorts of questions about how those things operate.
Yeah. We work with M3.
Yeah, so M3, you have Jeff Ireland?
Yeah.
Yeah, Jeff's outstanding. So yeah, Jeff would be able to tell you about all sorts of health task forces they've had or standing committees. And just like with the comp plan, I've found having those staff ambassadors, and even to Diane's point, even if I got on there because I'm really interested in health benefits because I utilize them a lot or something, it's important to have that voice and have them get the information directly from Jeff versus getting it from their coworker who may or may not understood how the system works or why suddenly I can't go to that provider anymore where they think it was something the district did, where it was really a merger and acquisition that two different healthcare providers had.
Ruth, correct me if I'm wrong, but we've had a insurance committee before in the past, correct?
Yeah, probably at least 5 years, maybe 6. Participation is slowly dwindling over time, so it might be time to see who else might be interested, but we try to have each building represented and each employee category.
Okay, that's what I thought. I just wanted to make sure I,
Yep, thank you.
And the board may remember that this past spring, when we changed the structure and the plan structure and went with the HSA, Jeff and his team from M3 were vitally at the center of kind of how we made that switch, and sort of recommending some different choices and options that we did feel like, wow, we had to do something to maintain costs, but that advisory board was at least on the periphery of that conversation as we tried to work through that process.
Bob, based on your experience with all of these, what would you say a reasonable lifespan for a revised compensation plan is before it needs to be tended to? I mean, obviously you're always paying attention to it, but before you really need to sit down with a fresh new committee and go, okay, we need to look at readjusting this.
That's a great question, because I've had some that they've never had to do that. And then I've had others that, board A had a philosophy on compensation, and then board B came in and said, yeah, we don't want to do that. And so I haven't had one that went bust on economics, the financial impact that I've been involved with. And part of that is just hyper careful when we go through that. So Ruth and I would work so closely together with Steve and you to say, are you sure you want to do this? Because there was a district in southeastern Wisconsin that early on, they put in on paper what looked like a phenomenal pay plan for them. And they had all these goals on student learning outcomes because the board really wanted that. And the staff nailed it. And so what they thought were going to be aspirational and a small percentage of staff would get to it, the good news was a large percentage of the staff hit the student learning outcome goals. So, like one respect, you could celebrate that saying, oh, look at that. That's phenomenal. It motivated a certain increase in student achievement. But they found themselves in a very difficult spot if they couldn't afford it. They had to dip into fund balance to pay for it, and they couldn't sustain that. So now you're in this spot of, boy, how do we do this? We just gave them all these bonuses for student achievement, and we have to tell them next year we can't do this again. So I have had some who've completely scratched it, but they haven't been, they personally, and this is not an indication of, okay, I've gotten these right, because nobody does. They all change, but sometimes you can kind of see up front, that's going to be a problem, so that is your administration really going to want to put that much time into this, or the teachers? So I suggest that when you get done, you have a two-step process. One is there's like a whether it's twice a year or quarterly, there's a group or a subset of the compensation committee that continues to meet. And they might report to Steve and Ruth and one of you, hey, these are some things staff are saying. This particular element here, they're confused by this language where they heard you hired Jane Doe above the schedule, and they think it's for this reason. How do you document when you hire above the schedule due to labor market factors? They just like to have a clarification so we can report that back to the staff so the rumor mill stops. So those kind of things are helpful. Or, we didn't put National Board for Professional Teaching Standards in the original because nobody was interested. Now there's 2 staff persons who have started that. Do you want to reconsider that? So you can take care of small issues before they boil up. And then you could just decide, well, every 2 years, we're going to have the big committee come back together or something and meet 2 or 3 times. But like I said, I've had some that their pay plans have been in effect for 8 or 9 years now. They really haven't made big changes to it.
Excellent. Thank you for the information.
You're welcome.
Bob, is there anything that you think that we're missing? If potentially, the questions have run their course, is there, anything we haven't asked you that you would just think, well, wow, I'm surprised?
No, I think you've asked some very good questions. I think they cover it. I think the memo has anything else in that. And then if you do decide, we're going to have the presentation to the staff, Steve, I can send you, the draft of the presentation. Then we'd probably incorporate in some slides on what presently exists in your school system. But that basic presentation I worked on today, just updated ones that we've done before, so new data, et cetera. But that gets to some of those like teacher turnover questions or common things that are in a pay plan or that sort of stuff. And so then that can be another walkthrough document. And generally that meeting, you're an hour and a half, 2 hours, because you got the presentation and then the questions from people. And you'll have some people coming in who will be very skeptical, as to this is a fancy process for me to make less money. And then others who have a true desire to try to figure it out. And then some that will come in with solutions right away. And like I said, I don't come in with any predisposition other than I just want to make sure that you have the resources to fund it. That's it. Otherwise, if a board came in and said, we want to reward evaluations or student learning outcomes or additional degrees or credits, that's what I hope you do, that you've come up with a pay plan that works for you versus, oh, I went to this presentation and this is what happened. Because, just those 3 districts I mentioned, Heartland Lakeside or Kettle Moraine, Pewaukee, well, I'll add Pewaukee in there, and Sun Prairie, 4, I think, very good pay systems. They're completely different. I mean, they are not like each other at all, but they've all done a pretty good job of keeping their staff. So, and it sounds like you've done a great job of doing that. We just have to address some of that, sustainability piece.
Yeah, no, that's good to know. I just know that sometimes, we finish a session like this and think, oh, darn, we should have asked something or we missed something. And so certainly just maybe to recap, I mean, happy to get some of those things, to have this as an agenda item February 8th, get some of those figures to you. Also happy to reach out and communicate with the committee kind of in a celebratory way to thank people for their volunteer, and forthcoming service on that committee, and let them know a little bit about this discussion tonight, and that we'd like to have an initial meeting and probably, that March 1st date, not the February 10th date, try to explain why, and then kind of just continue to, following that February meeting, work with Bob to, prep that presentation, make sure that we are able to think about the survey there as well. And we'll plug away. It'll just look a little bit different, I think, than our original plan.
Yeah, Steve, if I could interrupt,
Mhm.
or add, there is one thing that I don't think was asked, and maybe it was just because everybody knew this. These meetings will be subject to the open meetings law, so they will be in open session in public. And the only ones that would get into close would be if you were to meet for yourself between just the board members and administration to go into closed session to talk about the pay for like individual board members, or not board members, teachers, for example. But otherwise, it's all an open session conversation, and the data is all going to be shared. So that piece of it, when staff already probably has seen this, Ruth, because you do a costing for total base wages, so they know each other's salary. But in an open session, you might have more people participating, seeing that. So a lot of that compensation information will be there right out front. So if it in advance, there's things in the pay grade you see that are anomalies. It's always good to say, well, this is why this person's at this level, because they were family and consumer ed and they were the only applicant, that sort of thing.
Steve, you're all set? Okay. Anything else? Well, Bob, we really appreciate you
Oh,
coming.
thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure, and look forward to seeing you all again, and you all take care and stay well.
Thanks, Bob.
All right, bye-bye. You're more than welcome.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.
And
Thanks,
Roseanne, then yeah, we can just, if the board has no other questions or comments, we can move to adjourn.
We can adjourn. Okay, anyone have anything else? Otherwise, I need a motion to adjourn.
Second.
Then moved and second, we adjourn. Okay, all in favor, we're going to say aye tonight. Aye.
Aye.
Okay,
Bye.
opposed? We are adjourned. Thank you. Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Good
In
night.
case, Toby, did you
Bye.
get who did the first on the adjournment?
I had Roseanne.
Okay, perfect.
That's
Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.
not better.
Night.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Bye.